Bienvenidos a Enconsenso, nuestras charlas sobre Bitcoin, blockchain y criptomonedas, porque es mucho más que una tecnología, es un entorno y es una comunidad. Yo soy Elena Cases y seré su anfitriona hoy. Bienvenidos a Enconsenso, welcome to Enconsenso. Nuestro invitado de hoy no necesita presentación. We have Andreas. Hello, Andreas. Welcome to Enconsenso.
Hello, Elena. Thank you so much for having me on the show. I really appreciate it.
No, thank you. So, open, public, permissionless, borderless, neutral, censorship resistant. Sorry, my English, it's just enough to go. Available for all the other 6 billions. Isn't it kind of too good to be true? It's an utopia?
It's a utopia if we hope to achieve all of it and all of it soon. Yes, that's unlikely to happen. But the interesting thing is that if we only achieve some of it, and even if it takes years and years, it is a vast improvement over what we have now. So it's worth fighting for, and it's already surprising how much of that has been achieved in the time it has been achieved.
A ver, si es demasiado para hacer en poco tiempo, lo de poco tiempo podría ser relativo. ¿Qué es lo que podríamos dejar por fuera? Los 6 billones evidentemente vienen en camino, se nos están acercando. No son 6 billones, pero digamos que poco a poco somos cada vez más. Y además, la necesidad priva, la necesidad pulsa, es necesario Bitcoin para un montón de gente, como nosotros en Venezuela, como Argentina, como me imagino que Grecia todavía tiene sus propias necesidades.
Yes.
¿Qué es lo que podríamos dejar por fuera? O sea, ¿por qué no pensar en que la utopía es real y de verdad al alcance de la mano?
So, if I understood correctly, this is about the 6 billion. It's necessary now. It's already happening in Argentina and Venezuela. Why do I not believe that it can be a utopia? Why can't we?
Yeah.
Because I think humans have a tendency to create problems. So Bitcoin as a technology is effective, and it has some fairly pure intentions. But once you introduce humans, they will find a way to play the rules in order to gain advantage. So my political ideology is that no matter what rules you choose, no matter how well designed the rules are, no matter how pure of intention the rules are, if humans are able to use their full ingenuity and creativity, they will find ways to take advantage of the rules. They will find loopholes. They will find ways to cheat. And once they get a tiny bit of advantage, even a tiny bit, like a 0.5% advantage with those rules, they will use that 0.5% advantage to give themselves more advantage and more advantage and more advantage until eventually they break the rules completely and they twist the system, whatever the system is, to serve them. And that happens with capitalism, it happens with communism, it happens with all isms It happens with Catholicism.
Oh.
It happens, and it will happen with Bitcoinism too, in that people will try to take advantage of the rules, and people are ingenious and they will find a way to take advantage of the rules. So from my perspective, there is no system that can be set up that has perfect rules that work automatically and that people can't cheat, because people are smarter than any rules you can set up, and because things change over time. So the reason I don't believe in a Bitcoin utopia is because I think that people will find ways to cheat. They'll find ways to break the rules. They'll find ways to twist the rules for their advantage. Now, it may take decades to do that. And in the same time, we're going to have a much better, more fair system. And these rules are stronger than all of the rules we had before. And so this is a system that resists that kind of control better than many other systems, because we use software and not decisions by committees. It's much harder to corrupt the rules than if you simply, cheat in the elections, put all of the people you want on the committee, and then have them change the rules. So I think we've got a very good chance, but I don't believe that this is a perfect system that cannot be cheated and will never need to be changed. So what's more interesting is, how do we continuously build on this idea and make it better, so that when people cheat, we can create new systems that are fair, that fix that cheating.
So Bitcoin is strong, but not that strong to beat humans.
Nothing is perfect, because humans are ingenious at cheating, and that's the other thing. Like, we currently talk about how evil banks are, or how evil central banks are,
And governments.
or how evil governments are. But if you think about it, the banking system we have today replaced a system that came before, where only kings and princes had banking, and where only men with land and armies could have banks. And the banking system actually gave financial freedom to billions of people, and it allowed everybody around the world to start using money the way kings and princes did. The systems of government we have today are still better than feudalism. They're still better than having a king who inherits from their father.
Well, a little bit better.
A little bit better.
Yeah.
Yes. And in many countries, a lot better. And in some countries, not much better. But still, it's better than Game of Thrones. And so those systems liberated millions from poverty, liberated millions from monarchy, liberated millions from feudalism. And then people found a way to exploit them and cheat and change the rules. And now we need better systems, and we're making them. And we're using new things like software and communications networks and the internet to make these new systems to serve us for the next 100 years, or maybe the next 200 years. But eventually, of course, we can make systems that will help a lot of people gain more freedom. But eventually people are going to find ways to cheat. And so then we'll need to make new systems.
Yeah. Bitcoin nos enseñó muchas cosas. Sistemas económicos, banking without banks, monedas sin fronteras, el poder que tiene los otros 6 billones que pueden tener ¿Qué más crees tú que nos puede enseñar Bitcoin? What else do you think we can learn from Bitcoin?
I think what we can learn is how we can write rules in software that allow us to organize trust among millions of people who have never met, who do not have to trust each other, but can all trust that the software will protect their interests. And this is another expression that you hear in Bitcoin, which I think is important, which is rules without rulers. This is a system where there are rules. You often hear people say Bitcoin is not regulated, which is not true. Bitcoin is the most regulated system of money that has ever existed. It is regulated by software. It is regulated by rules written in the software. And it has a mechanism that makes it very, very, very difficult to change those rules, so that you can trust that the rules will still exist tomorrow. Because lots of people have tried to change them and failed. And when they try to change them and fail, they lose a lot of money, which is always a good way to prevent them from trying again. But so until now, we've had rules, but a lot of those rules require us to accept rulers, to accept people in charge of the rules. And in modern societies, we try to make it so that those people are accountable to other people, are transparent, are responsible, and that they have and that we have the opportunity to replace them or to see what they do with the rules. At least that's the idea of a liberal democracy. But again, there's a lot of opportunity for corruption. So the idea of rules, but without people ruling those rules or making it very, very difficult for those rules to change, essentially almost like a constitution written in software where the constitution is very difficult to change. That gives people a level of trust. And I think that's an important lesson because that lesson goes beyond money. Money is the obvious thing you can do, the most obvious, the first thing that you can do if you have a system of rules that don't change. But there's more than money. And I think one day we're going to look at this as a way to do governance. So to build governments, either small governments, a government for your village, a government for your school, a government for your university, a government for your city, and then even bigger governments where the rules of how the government works are written in software and can't be changed. And people get to choose how to participate in that. I think that's a bigger lesson because that's even more powerful than just money. But in order to make that work, we first have to do money.
Ya estás hablando de Ethereum. It's Ethereum and DAOs that make little governments, no?
Maybe. It's not really about which system we use to do this. Ethereum's primary application, in my mind, is governance, just like Bitcoin's is money. But both Bitcoin and Ethereum and many other systems demonstrate this concept of rules without rulers, and they explore different parts of that idea. And of course, we don't know which ones will be successful. And many might be successful. And we've got to figure out how to make this idea better and how to build systems that allow us to explore this idea more. It's not easy. It's actually easier to do with money than it is with other types of rules, because money in itself has a mechanism for security. So one of the key ideas that comes from Bitcoin is that the security of the system depends on money being used both as a reward, as a punishment for following the rules or not following the rules. So the way we secure the rules is by giving rewards to the people who follow the rules, and making sure that it costs a lot if you break the rules. So with money, it's a lot easier to build a system of rules without rulers. With governance, it's more difficult because you either have to again use money, and that creates some complicated situations, or you have to find other mechanisms of incentives or other mechanisms of behavior to protect the rules from corruption. So it's going to be an interesting experience, I think, because we're at the very, very first stages of an experiment on building systems that could be the basis for society for hundreds of years.
Sí, estamos en un cambio de fase y es muy interesante.
Mm-hmm.
¿Cómo puede una persona no técnica, no tech person better
Mm-hmm.
protect their privacy with maybe Bitcoin or DAOs help with that?
Bitcoin privacy is certainly not perfect. It's very far from perfect. So a lot of people, when they first come to Bitcoin or other cryptocurrencies, assume that these things, or hear from people that these things are anonymous, and that is not true. Bitcoin is pseudonymous, meaning that your money has an identity in a Bitcoin address, and that identity may be connected to your identity as a person or not. It's actually quite difficult to prevent the identity of your Bitcoin from being connected to the identity of you as a person, especially if you use certain methods for buying or investing in Bitcoin. But for the average person, I think a more interesting idea happens when you stop thinking of Bitcoin or these cryptocurrencies as investment, and instead you think of them as the money of an internet economy. And then instead of thinking of buying Bitcoin, you think about earning Bitcoin as part of your job. You see, the interesting thing that happens then is if you're not buying Bitcoin, if you're not giving national currency to get Bitcoin, but instead what you're giving is your time, your labor, your creativity. If you earn it as a wage, or you earn it as income for a service you provide, or you earn it in return for a product that you make, then there really isn't identity attached to it. In many ways, especially if you're operating on an international market, you can earn cryptocurrency by doing work, where the person who pays you the cryptocurrency is not a giant company like an exchange that has connections with the government and is providing information on everybody's identity to the government directly, as all exchanges are. Instead, if you're earning Bitcoin from someone who is employing you, as an employer, I pay some of my employees in Bitcoin. I know who they are, and I have information on who they are. But I'm not required to report to the government which Bitcoin address belongs to which person who works for me, yet, at least. And so what that means is that I can give a lot more privacy. And at the same time, when I get paid to go and speak at a conference or to help a company or whatever, and I get paid in Bitcoin or Ether or whatever, they don't report to anyone that Bitcoin address that I gave them actually belongs to me. So that Bitcoin has a lot more privacy, a lot more anonymity connected to it. If I go and sell it on an exchange, of course, then I'm going to immediately connect it back to my person. And so this is a difficult game. And most of the difficulty comes when you touch the traditional money system. If instead of selling my Bitcoin that I earn through my work, I use it to pay my employees, and they use it to buy something, and the person they buy it from uses it to pay their employees, and their employees use it to buy something, and et cetera, and we simply keep using the cryptocurrency in an economy, not converting it, not switching it back and forth into national currencies, but simply using it the way we use a national currency, and using it as the mechanism for exchanging services and products and value in an economy, then there is no identity attached to it. It becomes cash. It becomes exactly like cash. And yes, if you take 100 trillion bolivars and you go to a coffee shop and you try to buy a cup of coffee, theoretically, they could write down the serial numbers of your cash, right? Just like if I take $10 and I go to a coffee shop and I buy a cup of coffee, theoretically, they could write down the serial number, and then they could ask me to show ID, and then they could make sure they know that that $10 bill came from me, etc. But nobody does that, and it's very difficult to do at scale. So the way governments control today is by making sure that any point where you change Bitcoin into national money or national money into Bitcoin, they collect everybody's identity. So don't change it. It's really, really quite simple from that perspective. Don't change it into national currency. Don't change it from national currency. Instead, use it as cash. Use it as money. And it seems simpler than it is, of course. It's difficult to do in practice. The technology is not easy to use. The security is not easy to use. At sometimes we have very high fees, so you need to use new technologies like the Lightning Network, and those are not quite ready and easy to use. So this is still an experiment in progress, but we can see where this is going. And where it's going is, for people who really need this technology, they're going to overcome all of these obstacles, I think, and they're going to increasingly start using this technology as money in order to run an economy, almost a parallel economy on the internet, that is borderless, permissionless, censorship resistant, et cetera, et cetera. So Bitcoin is the technology that is open, borderless, neutral, censorship resistant, et cetera. But with that, you can run an economy that is borderless, neutral, and censorship resistant. And that's where things get interesting, right? If we simply take Bitcoin and we park it into cold storage and never use it, then we don't get any of the interesting properties. It's still very useful. It's very useful for protecting your savings. It's very useful for being able to move in and out of countries, but it's not as useful as if we use it as money.
Yeah, I think estaba pensando en la ley de Gresham.
Mm-hmm. Gresham Law.
Gresham Law. En Venezuela, si tengo bolívares y bitcoins, yo prefiero gastar los bolívares. In that sense, claro. Bitcoins, I don't use my Bitcoin. I save it. Trato de gastar los bolívares lo más rápido que puedo. So, Gresham Laws is el enemigo de Bitcoin?
No, because Gresham's law is first and foremost an enemy of the Bolivar in this particular story, because what it does is, by pushing you to spend Bolivars as fast as possible, it causes the inflation to accelerate and the value to drop even faster, because you don't want the Bolivars and nobody wants the Bolivars. All of the prices.
Ni siquiera el gobierno quiere los bolívares.
Yes. Only the government. So in Gresham's law is really only an issue in environments of tragic crises like you have in Venezuela. And I want to be realistic about this. Um, Bitcoin can't save Venezuela. Um,
No.
Bitcoin is not ready for Venezuela. Venezuela is not ready for Bitcoin. Every conversation I've had with people from Venezuela, it's clear. It can save some Venezuelans, but even in that case, of course, the Venezuelans that it's saving are the ones who were already rich by Venezuelan standards, who had education in English, who had education in technology, who had education and access to technology and infrastructure and internet connections and computers, um, which is a small percentage of the population. So um, this is not a technology that's going to save the people who need it most. Um,
Yeah.
but but what it's doing is it's allowing some Venezuelans to save themselves, and also to, I think, to create um, the motivation to build infrastructure. So all of the money that people make from mining or exchanging or transmitting Bitcoin into and out of Venezuela um, pays for more infrastructure in Venezuela and more wallets in Spanish um, and more information in Spanish and more videos and podcasts in Spanish, to help educate more and more people. I think what's interesting is what happens 10 or 15 years from now when another Venezuela happens, and hopefully not to Venezuela, but to another place. Venezuela has had enough crisis. But failed governments and failed currencies will continue, and perhaps even with more frequency than now. So this time, Bitcoin isn't ready. But in 10 or 15 years, if 15-20% of the population can escape into a digital currency like Bitcoin, that completely changes the dynamic of power of a government to control its population through currency. It completely changes it. If 15 or 20% of the population can simply exit the currency quickly, the government loses that weapon. And the possibility of taking the entire population hostage by closing the borders fails. Essentially, it's as if there's a wall, a currency wall around the country, and Bitcoin breaks through that wall. It knocks down the wall, and once one person can get through, they can pull other people behind them, and more and more and more and more people. And once you knock that wall down, the government loses the power to take the population hostage. I think one of the things that happens then is um, the government that knows that it can't take the population hostage has to choose a different path. It has to choose a different way of managing the economy, because it will know immediately, before it even tries, that this attempt will fail, right? Um, and and I think that's when things get really interesting. Just like when the internet first came out, it couldn't help people who were fighting a revolution, right? And even today, it can't yet, but it's already changing the way revolutions are fought. It's changing the way dictators respond to revolutions, and it's making it impossible for dictators to hide what is happening, um, because the wall of information is broken, and the whole world can see what's happening. And that's a big change. So I think in the next 10 or 15 years, that's going to happen with money too. And that's going to change how dictators behave because they won't have a choice.
Do you think world governments and world banks are already aware of Bitcoin and fighting back?
It's a really interesting and complicated question as to how aware they are and how much they're fighting back and how much they understand. I think most governments are very, very confused about this, primarily because they
Yeah.
believe they're the mythology of money that they created. So governments created a mythology around money that most people in the world believe. And this mythology is that money has value because the government says it has value. An economy needs to be controlled in order to be stable. A government has the ability to control or calibrate or steer an economy through central banking, and that without the control of government, economies go into chaos. And the funny thing is that not only do millions and billions of people around the world believe this mythology, despite all of the evidence that is the exact opposite, that value can exist without government, and often government can't create value even if it has complete control. In fact, it destroys value. That economies can be stable without government control, and in fact, the more governments try to control economies, the more they destroy them and create instability and chaos. Even though all of the evidence is the opposite, uh, billions of people believe this mythology. And the funny thing is that government economists, government bankers, government officials, government ministers, prime ministers, presidents, and dictators also believe the mythology. They believe the mythology even though they can see the evidence is against it, because it's such an effective mythology, and they've been living it for so long that they now believe it themselves, which is really quite funny. So what Bitcoin does in this environment is it creates a very difficult idea. They see Bitcoin and they say, okay, based on what I understand about money, the mythology we just talked about, Bitcoin should have no value, but it has value. It can't be money, but it is money. It can't possibly work, but it's working. It shouldn't last. It's going to collapse, but it doesn't, again and again and again. And they keep hoping that it's going to die on its own. It's going to stop having value. It's going to go away. It's going to be stopped by someone somewhere out there who's very powerful, that it's going to stop happening. And the opposite. It does have value. It is still there. It keeps doing what it's supposed to do, even though all of the mythology said it shouldn't. This creates a problem. For a lot of the government officials and the bankers and the economists, they don't want to believe that this thing is real or can be real or can work. So they think it's a joke. They think it's a game. They think it's a toy. Or they think it's just something that will pass, that that is just a bubble, a pyramid scheme, a Ponzi, something that only criminals will use, something that most people won't be interested in, something that will fail because it's fragile and weak and not serious, like their government money. And they keep thinking that, and of course, none of that is happening. Yeah, it's going up and down, and it's very, very volatile, et cetera, et cetera. but it simply refuses to die and refuses to go away. And people are interested in it, not just criminals. And this creates a very interesting situation, because in order to fight it, they first have to really believe that this thing is a threat. And instead, most governments and most government officials, I would say, don't believe this is a threat. They believe Libra from Facebook is more of a threat, because that they can understand. They can understand the idea of money that has a company behind it, that has investment behind it. They can understand that, even though that is less threatening, because it's more fragile, centralized, controlled. It's not borderless. It's not neutral. It's not censorship resistant. They can't understand any of these concepts. So they're more afraid of Libra than they are of Bitcoin. And that's great. That's really great. I hope they continue to underestimate cryptocurrency for a very long time. I hope they continue to think that they will be able to control it. They will be able to stop it. And I hope they keep fighting last year's Bitcoin, or Bitcoin from 2010. I hope they continue to be so far behind in their understanding of the technology that as they start to fight the basic idea of Bitcoin and all other cryptocurrencies, those basic ideas are changing so fast and moving so fast that they're always 10 steps behind. They're always fighting something that no longer exists because it's already changed. And if they continue to underestimate it like this, and if they continue to fight yesterday's Bitcoin, then we have a real chance of creating a lot of change, a lot of disruption, a lot of freedom, before they get their shit together, before they get organized enough.
Gracias, Andreas Antonopoulos, por dedicarnos el tiempo de responder nuestras preguntas. A nuestros oyentes, gracias por escuchar. Estas charlas en Consenso hacen parte de Criptonoticias, el periódico especializado en Bitcoin líder en habla hispana. Nos pueden encontrar en Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, YouTube, Telegram, en la web criptonoticias.com y ahora en formato podcast, donde sea que escuches tus podcasts. Gracias por acompañarnos.